Well, welcome to part 2 of Christian Answers, and we are talking about this interview that just recently occurred between Bruce Jenner, the Olympian, and Diane Sawyer, the ABC News journalist. And they had a conversation at Bruce Jenner's home in California, and they talked about this process that Bruce Jenner is undergoing from being a man. He's transitioning, so-called transition, into being a female. Now what he's doing, he's saying, is that inside of his male body, he's actually a female. He's got the body of a man, but he says that he's got the mind and the soul of a woman, and so what he's going to do now at age 65 is through surgery and through chemistry, he is going to mutilate his body. He is going to mutate his body. He is going to, through surgery, remove perfectly good and healthy organs and body parts, and he's going to replace those with the parts of a female. And he's going to try to shape and sculpt his body into female. Now, if that doesn't sound suspicious from a Christian standpoint, nothing does. This is a direct violation of God's created order. I already talked about the fact that in Matthew 19, Jesus teaches that God the Father created male and female. And I underscored the point that when God created them male and female in the beginning, we read in Genesis 1 and 2, that he created them male, their sex male, and their gender male, and then he created the female, Eve, and her sex was female and her gender was female. There's no separation between the sex of a person and the gender of a person. Now what we have today in society is people trying to say, oh yes, they're two different things. That is a false lie. And what is the problem is that people's thinking is confused about what they are. Not that their body should be changed or go through operations, or they should go through sex change operations, or they should make their hair look like the opposite sex or act and speak like the opposite sex. It's their mind that is confused. It's their mind that has a problem. Their mind needs to be helped and counseled, and they need to work through their issues that they have in their mind. But there's nothing wrong with Bruce Jenner's body. He is an Olympic male athlete who won the decathlon in 1976 as the world's greatest athlete. And now he's trying to say that he's a woman all along trapped in a man's body. And I'm saying that according to the Bible, there's nothing wrong with his body, and he's not trapped in it. It's just that he has a confused mind, and it's been confused by either someone or something, or he has confused himself, or he's got his thinking twisted, because after all, there are all kinds of people with all kinds of twisted and confused thoughts. And so we shouldn't be surprised that people today are confused and they're twisted and mistaken about their own sexuality. Let's look at another verse where it says in the Old Testament in book of Deuteronomy 22:5, it says, a man must not wear women's clothing, nor a man wear women's clothing, or a woman wear man's clothing, for the Lord your God detests anyone who does. That's a very strong word in the Hebrew, detests anyone who does. God's opinion and God's command here is that men must not confuse themselves or confuse others by wearing women's clothing, and women should not confuse themselves or confuse others by wearing men's clothing. In other words, God Almighty wants men to act like men, and he wants women to act like women. And he doesn't want the two sexes confused, and he doesn't want confusion sown in society, and he doesn't want people confusing others, and he doesn't want people confusing themselves about their own sexuality and their own gender. Well, that's exactly what we see that is contrary in our society today, because we see confusion about this. We see Bruce Jenner, for example, in the interview. We're looking at a confused and mixed up man. He is thinking that he needs to mutilate his own body in order to get it in line with his confused thoughts, rather than thinking about working on getting his mind healthy and submitting to the will of God, which is to conform to the gender in which you were given when you were born. And Bruce Jenner was born a male baby, and so he needs to spend his time conforming to that created order according to the Bible, rather than trying to take his body and mutate it and mutilate it to try to conform it to his own confused and mixed up thinking. And so we need to tell people today that we need to work on the mind and get right thinking and right thoughts, rather than doing these silly things like having sex change operations and putting chemicals in our bodies and distorting and twisting ourselves to try to do something that is totally unnatural and is actually a perversion of God's created order. Now we see in this passage in Deuteronomy 22:5, which in fact Diane Sawyer and Bruce Jenner quote in the interview, and they raise the question, what about the Bible, and what about this passage where it says a man should not wear women's clothing? The Lord your God detests anyone who does. They raise that question. They seem to be concerned about it, but then they go on and totally neglect it. They don't talk about it anymore, and they just totally pass it up as if it really didn't matter. It's in the Bible, but it doesn't really matter. Well, it does matter. And this is a command by God that has no limitations on it. Now, some of the commands of God were limited to the Jews in their time and their place. They were limited to the land that they were in. They were limited to the time that they were in. Some of them commands were limited to the rituals and the traditions that they did back then. But this one is a universal command. It has no limitation because it's a moral command, and we can apply it, and it has been applied by Christians since the time of Christ all the way up until the modern day. So, and the principle stands, and that is that society should not confuse itself, and individuals should not confuse themselves and others by dressing inappropriately. And a man to dress like a woman is inappropriate. A woman to dress like a man is inappropriate. Now you can talk about, well, what is inappropriate and what is confusing other people and what is not confusing, and those are the nitty-gritty details, but the principle is gender should not be confused. A man should not confuse his style of dress with a woman's, and a woman should not confuse her style of dress with a man's. And we can all understand it. It makes good sense. We don't want children, especially impressionable young people, confused about sexuality. They're confused about enough things. We don't need them to be confused about this. And that is one of the terrible things about what Bruce Jenner is doing. He's confusing young people. He's confusing children. He's confusing teenagers. He's confusing young adults. And he's trying to communicate that this separation between your sex and your gender, and he's born in a body, that's his sex, male, but his gender is actually female. That is a false concept, and we need to tell people about it, and we need to warn them and to not buy into that gender theory that is taking over our culture as we speak today. And we see that more and more in our culture today. So we need to warn people against that and warn ourselves and guard ourselves against that false misconception. Well, let's go to part 3 in just a second.